Hello, this is Dominexus, and today we're going to mold some terrain with the TerraMolder. I will begin by reloading the data pack to bring up the prompt. Click here to get started. Now, we're going to be using the noise toolset. As you can see, it gave me the items for the specific toolset, and it opened up these the local and the global page for the local and the global settings. Those are the miscellaneous tab under generic, containing generic settings, such as the click sound, if night vision is enabled or disabled, and if the left click detection uses an invisible ghast, or if it uses the swap control. The ghast is generally more convenient, so that is the default. So, the first thing we'll want to do is to generate a region we can work with. Now, these nodes are how we interact with the terrain. They represent the data of it, because the noise toolset uses controllable Perlin noise. Now, if we right-click with Generate Region, it generates a single square 16 by 16 region. But if we left-click with it, then it creates many more regions. Now, on the top of the screen, you can see that it keeps track of the objects being generated. That will be very useful in the future. So, using the Set Value tool, we can select a node, and then we get like a sort of preview of where it's going to end up. So let's say value 10. We right click to enter into the interface, and we left click to exit. So we create this little bump, and we can kind of do this with wherever we want. Now it may look kind of odd at the moment because it's kind of how do you put this, blocky. Now this is because set value alone isn't enough. We need set slope, because every single point has a specific slope, a rise over run slope, and it is defined as a vector. Say right here, we can make the slope this way. That kind of changes the direction of it, because if this one here is slope 0, it means that at this exact point it is perfectly flat. But at this exact point, it means that it is facing 1.1 over 1 this way, so basically 45 degrees, and this way on the z-axis, it has a slope of 1 over 0.6 over 1, so it's much flatter. The smaller the number, the flatter it is. The bigger the number, the steeper it is. So if we wanted something kind of slopey, we do that. But if we wanted something really steep, you can move it very, very far away. As you can see, this point is very, very steep. Now there is a limit to how far the slope can go. It can go out 3 units in any direction before the selection stops. I reason that is pretty much as far as someone would need in a practical scenario while using this tool. Now let's use the slopes on the ones that haven't had a value set. You can also set the values to be negative values. Now, technically they could go really far down, but because the void tends to like to kill things, I set the limit to how far the cursors can go down to -60 to prevent unwanted entity termination. So, set slope is how we can manually set the slopes. But if we kind of want to make it more organic, there are ways to do that as well. Because manually setting the slopes of every single point is kind of tedious. So we have the third tool, slope propagation. If I right click somewhere, the slopes kind of collect towards that area, as you can see. If I left click an area, however, the slopes are pushed away from that area and it becomes more or less a valley. This area, for instance, I can right click it and it'll become like a bump. And if I right click the same spot over and over again, it'll be kind of samey. It'll just be a big bump. But if I kind of go all over the place, then it can make it look more organic. Let's add some variation here. Now, a useful feature of these tools is that with set value and set slope, by left clicking, you can apply a random offset. However, I believe I set the random offset to be 0. Let me see. By using the gear, we can access the settings prompt. Under the local settings, we have editor, brush, and randomization. Now, I can access the various channels, red, yellow, and blue. They all intersect without any interference with each other. You can control the noise map as well, 2D and 3D. 3D nodes mapping in 3D space. We'll get to that later. And the octaves for finer and finer details. And then how far away we can see the nodes from. Also the delay feature, but that's not important for the time being. Appears I have it set to 5. See if I set it to 10. Oh, there it goes. So, by left clicking, it can apply a random offset to it. I just set that back to 0 so it has no influence. Going back to octave 16. By left clicking, I can apply a random vertical offset to the value. Some are greater than others. It's random, so you can't really tell. For the slope, left clicking sets it to a virtually random point as defined in here. The value offset determines the range of the value, and the slope range determines the length of the vector, the base value. The direction is completely random, mind you, and the offset determines kind of the random deviation from that magnitude. So in this case, it can be anywhere from exactly on it to 2 units away within that circle. It uses the sine and cosine functions as well as a random angle to define the vector. But frankly, I don't like the randomness. I like to use the slope propagation to kind of morph it to my liking. This spot's kind of low. How about we bring that up a bit? Let's make a big mountain here. I like mountains. I mean a real big mountain. Just right click it a bunch of times and the chunks will just naturally propagate towards this area. Ooh, that's a little odd looking. How about we adjust that a bit? Okay, that looks kind of better. Kind of want the surrounding areas to kind of follow along. You can kind of shape the beach to however you like. It's funny because we're using the void as like an ocean while we're carving this mountain. Or this island, I should say. These areas are kind of odd. How about we adjust that? There. It's looking very nice so far. Although, one must say, it is very smooth. And I've received a lot of critiques about older versions of the TerraMolder, that the terrain that it made was always really, really smooth. This is where the other octaves come into play. Now, we'll start with octave 8. Everything becomes twice as fine. Now with this, we can control smaller details and use slope propagation in much the same way. So for instance, if we wanted to create like a little road up here, we could do that. tool. So for instance, if we wanted to make this area kind of flat, I imagine we would set these slopes to go this way. Voila, we have a small flat patch. And one could imagine you could make a sort of road going this way. Look at that, it's basically a staircase, except for these two odd blocks, but it's all generated by the function, so you kind of just deal with it. Because you can morph the function however you like, little details like this aren't necessarily an issue. And we can get into even smaller detail with the with Octave 4. Creates like a sort of peak to the mountain. Use some slope propagation to kind of round out the whole thing. And just by placing some random slope propagations, we can kind of make the whole island a little more rugged. Now the object count got really high, but as you can tell, they generate really fast. Let's apply some offsets. Now, I think we need to be able to see the nodes from further away. There, now we have access to more nodes. This is forming like a kind of wall, it looks like. We can kind of morph it for however long we want to look like whatever we want. You can make like a little random island. Little rock spike. As you can see in these areas, the nodes follow the 2D surface. So if there's an area that we sent something under into the void, we can see how far down it deviated. Now, the data regions that all of this stuff is driving its information from is stored in the ceiling of the world at y equals 255. Now, included in that data is the height map of all of the channels for every octave, mind you. And this ensures that as the nodes are being brought into existence, that they all know where to map to, so that it creates this visual sort of experience while using the tool. Let's see, what would be the next feature to cover with this thing? Let's go back to Octave 16. Now, we do have the delayed feature. I personally don't use it because I don't really need it necessarily. However, if you want to make several edits, like say raise these up by a little bit, then for each edit you make, it leaves a little marker indicating that you made an edit there. And you just hit the end delay button to kind of render all of them at once. You can do the same thing with the slopes. Say you want to set the slope to over here instead. Now at this one, it has the source and a little particle trail leading to where it ends up. End delay there, and it, sets the slope to there. And same with the slope propagation. Now it has to spawn one for every node because every single node gets affected, and they all kind of center here where I clicked. Hit end delay there, and the slopes morph. I just turn that off because I don't necessarily need that much. Now, the one tool I haven't covered yet is render. That actually that's not necessarily useful when you're only using 2D noise. 3D noise is where render is used because it relates to preview, where the quality of the render is reduced for the sake of speed. And this is because 3D noise is much more expensive than 2D noise, as many of you probably already know. Because 2D noise, it's the complexity squared, while with 3D noise it's cubed. And so if you have a chunk of 16 by 16 2D noise, that's only 256 blocks have to be rendered. But if it's 3D noise, that's, what is it, 4096 blocks? That's quite the difference. Let's start by messing around with the other channels. Let's suppose red. Now with red, now in this page we can access all of the different octaves, which octaves are enabled. So you can see with blue we have all of them enabled. Now you have to have at least one enabled, so you can't just have one non-existent. In the case of red, for 2D, it's 16. And in here, for render, we have set to 2D and 3D. For now, let's just set it to 2D. So, going back to local, we have it set up to edit the red channel. So, what one may notice is that if I were to drag this up, the red generates in spite of the blue. They intersect and do not affect each other at all. And where they intersect is purple. Now, this applies to all three channels. Where blue and yellow intersect will be green, where red and yellow intersect will be orange, and where they all intersect will be brown. Just to show this, set that to 2D, grab a random node, bring that up. So we have green where these are, then we have some orange, and this over here should be brown. Yes. We can just bring that back down to 0 and pretend that it never existed. And the same thing with red. It is as if it never existed in the first place. We can go back to blue and then edit blue as we wish. Maybe that's a little too much. Kind of focus the hill over here. Just a wee bit. I like this shape. Let's see. Now, there's also brush. We can affect the brush size and how it behaves. So with the brush size, let's set to 2. Let's start with, say octave 4 so we can see what we're doing. So, instead of only affecting the single node, it'll affect the nodes around it as well. So if we increase this by 1, all of them will increase by 1. Now, this is because of offset. If it were a value, then you may notice this one says 2, this one says 2. Okay, they all say 2. Oh, this one says 0. So 0, 0, 2, 2, 0. So if I were to set this one to 5, then all the surrounding ones become 5, as opposed to if it was offset mode. So you got a 5, a 0, and a 2. If I subtract 3, and this becomes minus 3, this becomes minus 1, and this becomes 2. So offsets it by the same amount, while value sets it to that value. Now absolute kind of floors everything. Everything ends up at the exact same y value. Do note that this is not an option in 3D because something like that is a little difficult to track and ultimately, I think, kind of pointless. You can bring it back to offset and kind of do whatever we want with it. Now, the brush gradient makes it so that, for instance, if everything were at the same starting point, then we set it back to offset and enable brush gradient. If we set this to some really high value, then all of a sudden they're not offset by the same amount. Ones that are further away are slightly less. And this is proportional to the distance from the center. So the closer it is to the center, the more true it is. And it generates a cone the further out you go. Obviously only within the bounds of the brush itself. And brush size 3 is even more noticeable with this. So if I were to drag this up, it affects a much broader area. And this should work with all tools. Personally, I only use it with set value because the other ones are kind of weird. Because if one were to use it with the slopes, then all of the slopes kind of become the same thing, and it kind of makes it look weird. And I believe that slope propagation just makes the propagation affect a larger area. But when you mess around with slopes and the brushes, it starts to make everything get this weird repeating pattern. So I usually only use the brushes for set value. Now this here will come in handy in a second. And yes, I believe I already showed, yes, I showed this page already. So that appears to be all of the basic options. I'm going to fix this little area because applying the brushes to the slopes can be kind of ugly. It's all kind of ugly. A little rugged. Here this is facing. Just kind of level out everything. Okay, that should do over there for now. Suppose, like, you know, we want like a little, you know, land bridge sort of thing. And connect it a little bit. Slope propagation. Raise that up one block, and oh, there you go. It's a nice little essence to it, I suppose. This area is a little pointy, so we can change that as well. Move that down as well. You can probably tell why it's called the TerraMolder at this point, because we're literally molding this stuff to our whims. And we can really make it look like whatever we want to. And with that, I believe that is everything relating to 2D noise. Now, on the topic of 3-dimensional noise, let's use channel yellow to introduce it. Because channel yellow, yeah, let's set that to 3D. Let's see what that does. So, now it says not available at the moment because these chunks or these regions have not been generated yet. It only generates as much data as it actually needs to ensure that it doesn't overflow the memory. So, at the moment, it is set to the dynamic setting. So let's suppose we set this to 10. Now, at the moment, it just generates a big giant block with apparently a single notch in it. No, 2 notches, actually. Now, it is in this clunky state because of preview. Now, preview over here reduces the rendering quality for the speed of the preview. At the moment, the pixel size is 4. If it were 2, it would generate in smaller chunks. As you can see here, for 1. Oh, I'm sorry, I hit the render button. That is the wrong thing to use. Now, as to why it's so messy looking, that would be because of the values. Let's just set back that to 10. Okay, now you can see. This is pixel size 2 in action. Now, the reason why it was so messy at pixel size 1 is because all of the surrounding ones are 0, so it's probably some sort of rounding error on the part of Minecraft scoreboard system. So back over to brush, this in here. The dynamic thing opens up the value thing like this, while increment does it a little differently. So left click makes it go down by that amount, and right click makes it go up by that amount. Now, as you can probably tell, it takes a while for the 3D chunks to generate, which is why preview exists in the first place. So let's just set that back to 4 to make it go a little bit faster. Just kind of set these to 10 and maybe increase that one to 20. That way we don't have weird rounding issues. Generally speaking, if you are planning to use 3D noise, you'd want to have the 3D noise initialized as something that is not 0. How about we set this one to 40 and just keep setting the surrounding ones. You just let all those generate through and get kind of like a basic image of what the 3D noise is creating. Now, slopes, of course, exist in 3D as well, except they have 3 parameters this time. So suppose we wanted this slope to go kind of this way, but also up. Say right there. And it can look something like that. And slope propagation also works, but everything in 3D noise is slower, unfortunately. But that's just kind of what we have to deal with, because 3D noise is 3D noise. And now all of the local nodes have their, except for this one. We just set that to that. Okay, now most of the local nodes have some sort of slope attributed to them. So now we have some sort of blobby looking shape. Now this is where the render tool comes in handy. So if I left click here, it will render this chunk here on the positive direction. Now if I left click with it, it renders all of the chunks that are touching this node. And this is where the delay feature can kind of come in handy, because it also delays rendering. So I can quickly see, if I left click there, it leaves a mark. So I know that all of the chunks around there are going to render. So I can go to somewhere like here and set that to render as well. And this one should also need it. And also, just this one. And then I just end the delay. And that should render all of the chunks. You may notice that it tends to render the chunks that are near me. The system will pick a random player and then will start rendering the nearest next eligible object to that random player whenever it needs to pick a new object. There's only one object will generate at a time. And on the topic of that, we have the tick speed map. So if we were to just kind of render chunks artificially, it takes up approximately 40 milliseconds of the tick time before it just cuts off and saves it for the next part of the tick. This is because it uses this thing called a tick buster, as is known. And essentially what it does is it expands the world border size by 1,000 blocks within a second. So 1 block equals 1 millisecond. And this can be used to measure time, as the world border can actually change size even when the game is paused. So it uses the system time instead of the game time, so that can be used to ensure that the whole thing never lags and we always have a clean 20 TPS at all times, even when crazy stuff like this is generated. This is kind of odd looking, but with patience you can make a lot of stuff with 3D noise. I personally just prefer the 2D noise because it's faster and it just seems more elegant. Let's mess around with the hybrid between 2D and 3D. So under render, in case you couldn't tell by now, this controls how the different things render. Let's set that to 2D and 3D. That means that the 3D noise will take its opacity output and add to that the distance from the point it's rendering to the 2D surface. Now, under normal circumstances, air is negative and, solid is positive. So it basically subtracts the distance to that. And so you kind of get a remnant of both the 2D and the 3D working together. So let's start by rendering some basic red terrain. Just a little bit. And then, use slope propagation to kind of make it look a little more natural. Don't want that. I suppose you can keep that chunk there. Generally, this works better if you have everything preset to like y equals 64, so you can just start editing the surface itself, as opposed to having everything at 0. Now from here, now the 2D chunks only generate the 2D part. It's the 3D chunks that generate the 3D part. So, if we go back over to 3D, suppose we kind of set these randomly and whimsically to some odd values. Kind of set these to whatever we want to. Suppose we had like a really deep, strong negative value over here. We can actually carve a hole in the 2D. Okay, maybe not that strong. Yeah, let's make it like an arch looking thing. We can kind of shape it however we want to. Let's use some slope propagation. That was me punching the gas, by the way. And my throat hurts from all this talking. Let me just kind of let that preview through. So we have this odd looking form. Now, under the preview settings, we also have 3D chunk range. As in, when the 2D noise generates, suppose we set this to 3. When the 2D noise is generated, this parameter should determine how many 3D chunks generate up and down. I'm trying to... Oh, that's why there is no difference. Set that to 1 first for a moment. See, now it... Okay, yeah, now it's pretty clear what happens. Although it seemingly only affects that chunk, perhaps? Or it was simply out of range. This is why I prefer to render these things. Well, if we just increase the value to say, let's say 5. Let's see if 5 works. Will 5 make it look good? For some reason this chunk doesn't want to change. I wonder why. Suppose if we just change this to something. How odd. Well, if this were set to all, which is all 16 of them, then we mess with this, then that kind of generates the whole column. Holy moly, that is a lot of chunks. And a lot of them aren't really going to do anything. That is quite a bit. And this is why I added this button. However, because they're not rendering because of this, because see, this is still part of preview. If they're rendering because of this, then this button would cancel them. But at the moment, that's not what's happening. So I guess I can just be a little patient on this. And in the meantime, set this back down to like 0, so it doesn't mess with that, because I prefer to render everything manually in the 3D with this, as opposed to rendering from the 2-dimensional. But you see, once you have everything previewed out, you can kind of set it up to render everything, and then like go make a sandwich or something. Because you can basically just automate the whole thing. Okay, let's start by rendering that, and that as well. Say that as well. Just, wait for all those to render out. And you see, now we have, this strange hybrid between 2D noise and 3D noise, because it still obeys the height map of the 2D noise, but as you can tell, it has this little thingy in the middle that is not possible to create with just 2D noise alone. Now, there's also dynamic mode, and it's a kind of complicated to explain, but essentially, these 3D nodes, they kind of go up and down according to the 2D noise map. And if we set it to 2D4, we can clearly see the shape of the 2D height map. Setting that back to 3D. Now, with dynamic, these nodes go up and down such that this center point here is aligned exactly with the surface. So that point up in the sky is basically mapped down to the 2D surface, and the noise is kind of stretched and morphed accordingly. We can see this by adjusting this, that the nodes go up and down with it. And the reason it was designed was, like, if you had like an arch feature like this, I mean a better looking one than what I just made, if you had something like that in like a massive landscape, but then you realized that you had to like raise up the whole terrain by like 50 blocks, you don't want to have to remake your entire arch, so you can just, turn on dynamic mode and then just drag the whole thing up and down with the 2D noise. That was the general idea. It can make some really weird features though, if left to randomness. Don't necessarily have to demonstrate that. It's a little confusing. Now, let's go back to 2D, blue, for the next crazy feature, upside down. Now, upside down 2D is exactly what it sounds like. Now, to prevent myself from getting clogged in something, I'm going to go down here, underneath. I'm going to start rendering stuff. That didn't work. That's weird. Oh, I turned on 2D for red. I meant to turn it on for blue. Silly me. There it goes. That's more like it. Okay, so, as you can see, instead of rendering it on the ground, it renders it up in the air. And this can be very useful for like, giant, massive caverns. Because instead of dealing with the 2D noise, if you just have one channel act as the ceiling, and another channel act as the floor, and maybe another channel even then acting as the next layer up, as like the actual surface, then you can do all sorts of crazy stuff with it. Now, as you can tell, it just renders all the way up to the build limit, just as otherwise it would render all the way down. And it looks kind of weird when you have like a mixture between the two. Wouldn't want to get caught in that stuff. That would make me very uncomfortable. Oh, it almost got me. Looks kind of weird when it's inverted. Okay, let's turn that back off and re-render this whole thing. It's really nice how fast this stuff generates. Oh, almost got it. There. Okay, now we're all back to normal. So, as we've seen octave, we've seen render. Now printing kind of determines what it overwrites. Now this is useful because if one were to try to make terrain that was blended into vanilla terrain, like for the marketplace, for instance, because on the Minecraft marketplace, a requirement, as far as I'm aware, is that whatever map you make, it has to be incorporated into a vanilla world, so that if someone leaves the built or constructed area, they can kind of just wander off into normal terrain. And so that's a very useful feature to have. So with the printing page, you can control exactly, or the general categories of the blocks that it spares and destroys. So for instance, you could make it erase only like grass and flowers, and maybe also trees, but then spare dirt, for instance. And you can also control if the negative space has any effect. That's also very useful. The default is just replace everything, where it just kind of destroys everything except for the air. The air doesn't overwrite anything. So for instance, if I grab myself a stone block and just kind of place random stone blocks everywhere, let's set this to a smaller octave. So if I do this, stone blocks are still there, but if I do this, then the stone blocks that are clipped get erased. Then go and drag that one, and it just kind of deletes them. However, if I were to set that to off and then place the stone blocks, then it keeps it encased in it, so it kind of just ignores it. Of course, I prefer to take out everything because that's just how I like it. Let's get rid of that and go back to the normal inventory. Modified the little peak in the meantime. Maybe a little more slopey. Okay. Now we've seen preview. I believe the last set of features is under a region. This is how we can kind of program the regions, or the data regions, to kind of have preset data. Now, right now, everything is set to blank. Now, there's like a lot of information here, so it has to be divided into all these little areas, but it's less confusing than it looks. So suppose that we want to have just some random looking terrain, I suppose. So this makes it go up 1, this makes it go up 10, this makes it go up 100. Same thing for going down, and the blue in the middle makes it go to 0. So suppose it was 64, nice clean 64, and then it could go up and down 10 blocks. Let's just say 12 blocks. And then the slope range, I prefer this range. This range looks good. And then let's do something similar for octave 8. So like we can have the value, deviate 5. No. This for deviation. And then have the slope be the same. And then let's just have octave 4 not necessarily do anything. Say we can kind of, fly off somewhere and then hit this generate region button. Make sure we're not going to be eaten by the terrain when it generates. Go up here, activate this, and then what do you know? Everything's randomly initialized because we programmed the regions to do so. We can go over here and hit that. Now, some of these things are already touching what we've already made, and so it's all going to be continuous. But within chunks that are not yet generated, then it will continue to be purely random, and we may edit this base terrain just as the other terrain. Just now, instead of all of them being 0, everything is set to some random value. We can move that to right there, for instance, if we want to. Now, automatic region generation right here determines if editing an area near a boundary is going to create new regions around what you just did. If you have this disabled, then you can edit stuff right at the edge, and you don't have to worry about it making new stuff. This way you can absolutely determine the boundary size of your area. So you can have this on while you're kind of setting up how big you want your area to be. And then once you have the size determined, you can then turn it off. And of course, generate region always works regardless of that setting because it's manual. And so far you can do quite a lot of stuff with this tool set. Although there is one obvious thing is that the terrain is made of stained glass. It's not dirt or grass or anything. That will not be part of the noise toolset. That will be part of a future toolset or series of toolsets that will be added in the future. Not part of noise, because there will be several toolsets that can kind of work in conjunction with one another to create kind of the basic outline of it. And the reason I chose stained glass is for the different colors of the channels, but mostly because it's transparent and causes no lighting updates. Now let's double check everything to make sure we caught everything. I believe so. Seems to be everything. Now there's also under the miscellaneous this button called delete regions. So once someone is done generating a larger area, or once they're done, making their world, they can hit the delete regions button, and all of the data regions up at the top of the world are erased, at least within the loaded area. If your area extends beyond the loaded chunks, you will have to go off after them and kind of erase everything, because you don't want your published map to have artifacts of generating this stuff. But definitely do that when you're like absolutely sure you're done, because once you delete it, you can't retrieve this information because it's just gone. So save that for the very end. Other than that, I believe that's everything. Yes. So let me just clear out these items. The nodes automatically disappeared as soon as I no longer have the items, and it is fully multiplayer compatible. Multiple players can come and fly around as they please, editing whatever channels and octaves they wish, and the cursors don't collide or anything. So, in the future, the TerraMolder, this series of toolsets, become much more complex and sophisticated as I add more and more stuff to it, and hopefully I will be able to keep updating everyone about the progress. I'm mostly doing that on the Discord server, on my Discord, which the invite link will be in the description. But hopefully each time I add a new significant feature, I'll make a video about it like this and then post it. But I believe that's all for now. Have fun, and we'll see where this thing takes.